Welcome everybody to this joint Australian Housing Researchers Conference public lecture which we are co-hosting with the Henry Halloran Urban and Regional Research Initiative. I'm Nicole Gurran, Professor of Urban and Regional Planning here at the University of Sydney and co-chair of the Australasian Housing Researchers Conference. Welcome to the conference delegates, and also to, I think we're getting a bit of mic echo. Is that right? How are we going? Okay, back there? Sound okay? Okay. This is strange. Now we're okay, I think. Okay. And welcome to those of you who are Sydney-siders who are familiar with the Henry Halloran Research Trust events, and this is one of those events as well. Before I go any further, of course, I want to acknowledge country. We're here on the unceded lands of the Gadigal people in the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to the traditional custodians of this land and to elders past, present and emerging. And in doing so, I want to particularly acknowledge the first speakers that we had actually at today's conference plenary, which was about First Nations models of housing. And I think if there's one takeaway that we should put front and centre of tonight's conversation, it's the reminder by Dr. Michael Mossman, who is Associate Dean Indigenous at the School of Architecture, Design and Planning here at the University of Sydney, and also one of the creative directors of Australia's Architecture Biennale Pavilion for 2025, which is all about home. And his reminder to us this morning was that we talk all about housing, and certainly I'm guilty of this, absolutely. We talk all about housing, but we forget that actually really it's all about home, and that's something that of course is so deeply significant when it comes to understanding connections to culture, community and of course country. But it's also just, you know, enormously important in relation to communities and people's capacity to engage. So home is so much more than housing, and I think that's a really, really salient thing for us to remember. Tonight's agenda is big and it's really topical, and that's why we've got such a lot of people here to discuss it. I was reading the newspaper the other day. The fabulous Ross Gittins actually put in an opinion piece saying that he's now optimistic about housing. And not because the housing situation has turned a corner, quite the opposite. Ross Gittins is definitely a Pollyanna kind of a person. He's optimistic about housing because now things are so bad. In his view, everyone's finally going to take notice and do something about it. And Ross, you know, fabulous economic analyst and journalist, sees great hope in the National Housing Accord to deliver 1.2 million homes over the next 5 years. I'm very hopeful about that too. Ross's hope is that it signals finally all to Commonwealth and state, but potentially local government as well, taking joint ownership and responsibility for housing to deliver the new supply. He says also, of course, that we need big investment in social housing. We need a fairer and more efficient tax system. We need, he even talks about reform to the Reserve Bank, as well as help for the construction industry. But of course, the big focus in delivering the National Housing Accord has been planning reform. And in fact, the big piece that's been released by government is the National Planning Reform Blueprint, released last year, which requires, and believe it or not, the states have already submitted their first annual reports into their planning reform designed to deliver 1.2 million homes. And we'll talk about some of those reforms. But In the middle of this Australasian Housing Conference, which has brought together researchers from around Australia and around the world, I couldn't pass up the opportunity to draw on some of the national and international expertise that's in Sydney at the moment, because not only have we been talking about planning reform for, at least 20 years in New South Wales, longer actually, much longer, but it's also a subject. Reforming land use regulations is also a subject, that's very high on the agenda internationally, because of course Australia is not the only country facing affordability crises, facing a deep affordability crisis, I should say. And we're absolutely not the only country saying that reforming land use regulation with the goal of unlocking more housing supply might be the structural fix that we need for affordability. So having said all of that, I'm going to introduce our speakers in a moment. And as I do, you'll understand why we're going to have such an interesting conversation, because we've got two international experts who are across not only the international research on the relationships between sort of land use regulation and reform, but also the practice and how it's played out. Particularly, we'll look at this evening, particularly at how it's played out in the United States and in Canada. And actually, I think Professor Chappell is going to give us a bit of an international survey as well. We also have eminent Australian researchers and an eminent practitioner to talk not only about our experience with planning reform to date, but also some of the progress that we're making towards delivering our supply target. So we're going to hear from each of our speakers in turn, and then we are going to open it up to a Q&A. We won't be doing an open mic because I was flooded with questions from those of you who registered. There were more than 50 questions actually submitted. I showed them to our speakers, not so that they could rehearse their answers, but to, ask were there any favourites. They were blown away actually. They're great questions, and so we're going to be using those. We will go through as many of those as we possibly can, and thank you for submitting them. So let's begin by introducing Professor Karen Chappell, and I'll introduce each of the speakers, and it's important that we hear a bit about their background so you know where they're coming from, but I'll introduce them each and then I'll invite them up. So Professor Karen Chappell directs the School of Cities, and she's Professor in the Department of Geography and Planning at the University of Toronto. She studies inequalities in planning, development, governance of regions in the Americas, and she's focused actually on economic development and housing. Amongst her awards in 2023, Professor Chappell received the Sir Peter Hall Award for Lifetime Contribution to the field from the Regional Studies Association, which is a very significant honour, of course. And her books are very relevant for Sydney, include Transit-Oriented Displacement or Community Dividends, and another book, Sustainable Cities and Regions Towards More Equitable Development. She's written much more than that, but there's some highlights. Our second speaker is Dr. Christina Flair-Hope-Stacey, who is a Principal Research Associate in Housing and in the Housing and Communities Policy Centre at the Urban Institute in Washington. I think we're very, very fortunate to have you, Tina. She specialises in urban economics, housing and transportation. And Stacey's research includes, and again, list too long to read, but it includes a list of a national study, recent national study actually, on land use reforms and their impacts on housing affordability, as well as how rent control and inclusionary zoning affect affordable housing supply. Professor Stephen Rowley is Professor and Director of Research in the School of Accounting, Economics and Finance at Curtin University. He's been Director of the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, so HURI in other words, Curtin Research Centre since 2011. And he's a member and past chair of the Western Australian Housing Industry Forecasting Group. Over the last 20 years, Stephen's published over 100 articles focusing on housing affordability, the supply of market and affordable housing, and the impact of policy settings on residential development outcomes. Dr. Catherine Gilbert is a lecturer in urban and regional planning here at the School of Architecture, Design and Planning. She's the urban planner on the panel, well, one of them, amongst the economists there. She's got expertise in land use policy, development control practices, housing systems, inclusionary housing approaches, and her research investigates the consequences of declining housing affordability, as well as the design and effectiveness of planning-based interventions and policy reforms. I think you're all very familiar, most likely, with her path-breaking work highlighting the exodus of key workers from Australian cities. And last but absolutely not least, and probably very, very well known to at least the Sydney members of the audience, is Tim Sneesby, a manager of strategic planning at a Sydney council. He's here in his own capacity, of course, but he does manage strategic planning at a Sydney council, and he's an honorary senior lecturer here at the University of Sydney. He's worked in an urban economics consultancy in Sydney and as a planner in London, and throughout his career, of course, he's worked with developers as well. He's a recipient of the Planning Institute of Australia's National Young Planner of the Year Award, and tonight his views are his own. Let's give a peremptory clap to this amazing panel. And Karen, I invite you up.
Okay. We have the clicker. Okay. So thank you so much for the introduction and the invitation to Sydney. I'll come to Sydney anytime anybody invites me, so just keep that in mind. Really delighted to be back. So what I'm going to talk about is what I'm calling upzoning the Anglosphere, and that's really because the case studies that we've been focusing on are in Australia, the United States, and Canada, and New Zealand too. So I'd like to talk about how we can land on a theory of what happens when you upzone, given that outcomes are so variegated, so diverse. And this comes out of work that I've been doing with Nicole. Nicole and I have been in this conversation for about 4 years or something. And in fact, Nicole and I co-sponsored, the Henry Halloran Trust and the School of Cities co-sponsored a session last year at the Urban Affairs Association in New York on this topic. So we are deep in the research and thinking about why outcomes vary and how effective upzoning actually is at addressing housing affordability. So the theory is that allowing more density through upzoning is supposed to result both in new housing supply and lowering prices. And the issue is that it doesn't always work out. So let me give you some examples of the outcomes we are seeing around the world. So in some cases, when we have more density, we have lots of new housing supply, but not very much affordability at all. So my best cases here, how about Sydney and Toronto? And so these places are actually quite similar. So it's not that these places have gone through massive upzoning. In fact, it's much more ad hoc. In both places, you can basically get the density you want because the state or the province will permit it. And so supply comes when the market will enable it. There's lots of supply built, maybe not right now, but in general, it follows the market and it builds tall and sprawl, basically. Those are the housing types that we see. And these types, interestingly, particularly the condo buildings, are not really likely to trickle down to become affordable anytime soon. They're disproportionately luxury units. They're very small. They're not family housing and very difficult to get affordability out of it. Then there are the cases where you have new housing supply, you get some affordability, and at the same time, you get some gentrification and displacement. So where am I talking about? Basically California and New York. So these are hot markets, very much like Sydney and Toronto, but they're all making a concerted effort to do blanket upzonings, or at least large-scale upzonings. And they all benefit from having safeguards in place that you don't have in Toronto, and I think maybe you don't have them in Sydney either. You have inclusionary zoning, for instance, producing substantial amounts of subsidized affordable units. But since the upzoning is primarily in low-income neighborhoods, they're experiencing gentrification and displacement at the same time. So in essence, what you see with the upzoning is market shifts to the lower income areas, just moving the affordability problem around the city. Then you have the cases where there's some new housing supply, but higher prices too. And my example here is actually Brisbane, and this is one study that I've read by Cameron Murray and Mark Lim, that found that upzoning was leading to lots of new capacity, but most of that new capacity was not actually resulting in new housing supply, and when new housing supply did result, it raised prices instead of lowering them, oddly. So then there are the cases where there is some new housing supply, but really it's for middle income and maybe some moderate income households. And so here we have the programs to upzone for missing middle housing and accessory dwelling units, or ADUs. And what's striking here is that a well-designed policy, like you see in San Diego, in Portland, and Houston, can lead to new supply, but it's very hard to get it to be affordable below the middle income or moderate income household level. So in San Diego, you have the ADU bonus program, which is allowing multiple ADUs on a lot, creating what they call granny towers. On the left, those are what they are. Those are 2 ADU triplexes. And they're about half of these units, and there's been 1,000 built, about half are affordable at 110% of area median income. Middle income housing. In Portland, you have the residential infill project, which has produced a significant number of multiplex units. They're more affordable than single family homes, but they're essentially market rate. In Houston, a significant amount of supply has resulted by subdividing single family parcels into townhouse lots, creating what they call tall and skinny houses. These are also affordable, but primarily at the middle income level and above. Then you have the cases where you have upzoning, but there's not really much new supply at all. So Minneapolis may have started the upzoning movement in North America at least, but in it and St. Paul, which is shown here, there are only a handful of new buildings and generally not affordable. And then in Chicago, where the lack of new housing supply in upzoned areas was very powerfully demonstrated in a paper by Yona Freemark. So there's one case where there's lots of new housing supply, but lower prices. And the question is it an exception? Auckland. Auckland may have kind of unique circumstances of very low density to start with, other reasons that it actually did seem to result in lower prices. So I'm gonna wrap up here with some simple lessons. So capital looks for profit. This is not very surprising. But we tend to forget when we design policy that the low-hanging fruit is always going to be the first to go, the low-income areas, where you can make the most money. Secondly, actors influence outcomes. So we're getting very different outcomes in different cities, in part because of people. In some cities, there's entrepreneurial staff. That's what we've seen in Portland, Oregon. In some places, like Toronto, there's a very powerful real estate lobby. So outcomes are going to differ. Thirdly, upzoning is insufficient and maybe unnecessary for affordability. So the common theme across these cases is that when we upzone, we're not necessarily seeing affordability. And in fact, there are other tried and true ways of getting affordability if you want affordability. So we may actually be barking up the wrong tree with upzoning. And finally, upzoning may exacerbate existing inequalities. So in so many of these places, the people benefiting from upzoning are not those in the greatest housing need. So, thank you.
Thanks, Karen. I can feel the controversy starting to stir already. Okay, Tina, please come up.
Hello, everyone. Tina Stacy, Urban Institute, Washington, D.C. Like Karen, I will also come back here anytime, and I am considering not going home to D.C. afterwards. I'm just kidding. Let me see. Okay, so I work at the Urban Institute, which, if you're not familiar, is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization located in Washington, D.C. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of what I know of the insides of what's happening, the policy debates at the local level. In the U.S., going to focus mostly on local right now. And yeah, so I'll start with, I think probably everyone in this room knows, or at least in the U.S., this is the case. Not as familiar with the Australian case, so I'm really excited to learn about that while I'm here. But what's wrong with current zoning policy in the U.S.? We have, and in many other places, we have very restrictive zoning, making it difficult to build much more than single-family homes in many places, right? And this type of zoning is associated with less construction, higher housing costs, higher economic and racial segregation, and higher automobile dependence with clear implications for climate change. And so in response to this, many state and local governments and in the past administration, the federal government was also moving towards incentivizing upzonings and land use reforms at the local level to help address housing supply shortages. So reforms like accessory dwelling unit regulations, like Karen had mentioned, this is my friend's ADU in her yard. Our city recently passed an ADU law allowance, have become very popular, as have missing middle upzonings, which is basically often allowing plexes, duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes on previously zoned single family home lots. As well as transit-oriented development, which would be higher density near transit, at the most basic level. So a lot of places are turning to these reforms, and like Karen said, the impacts aren't as clear-cut as we might have expected based on, we know that the zoning we have has gotten us here, but does reversing it reverse those impacts in an equal and opposite way? So first of all, many places have seen low uptake of development after zoning, so that first question of, after upzonings, can we even get those upzonings to lead to increased supply? Well, the first step there, is making sure that whatever you're upzoning to pencils out for developers, right? Otherwise, it's not gonna work. Like Karen also had mentioned, Minneapolis, this is just one example. It was one of the first major upzonings in the US. Early research there actually showed fewer multifamily units permitted compared to a counterfactual created from a synthetic control model. There has been a little bit more progress there, but people actually attribute the progress to parking minimum reductions rather than to the upzoning. So some lessons we're learning there. We also recently conducted a study, I know Nicole mentioned, where we used machine learning to collect data on land use reforms across the US from newspaper articles, and then looked at their impact on housing supply and costs. And I will note, land use reforms in the US have generally been much smaller than, say, what was seen in Auckland. So this is all types of reforms, and some are quite small. But we did find a statistically significant increase in supply, yet very small, and only at the top end of the rent distribution. As you might expect, right? New development is going to invariably be nicer, newer, and more expensive. But not really seeing much impact there. So now the discussion in many places is really turning to, okay, if this isn't working, what else? What are the other barriers that we need to break down in order to kind of address the supply issue? So a lot of places are thinking about financing. ADUs are a perfect example. It's very hard in the US to finance an accessory dwelling unit. Most people have to have their own saved up cash to be able to do it. There's a lot of discussion about fees at the local level. Are there ways that fees can be reduced to help bring down those construction costs? Permitting, speeding up permitting processes, which can be quite extensive and have a lot of opportunities for community opposition, which is the last bullet, but I'll just mention it there. Those are very intertwined and related. So looking at a lot more opportunities for by right development to speed up that process. There's also a fear of lawsuits. I'll note, so Arlington, my next door neighbor, actually live in Alexandria, Virginia, right outside of DC. And we had just passed a missing middle upzoning 4 months ago. Our next door neighbor, Arlington, passed one a couple months before that. We both are being sued. Arlington lost theirs. So their missing middle reform was revoked. and we have the same judge. So we're expecting a similar outcome. So I think, that definitely affects developer behavior if they think that the reform isn't going to remain in place. But when my city, for instance, upzoned, they didn't really change anything else that makes it more profitable for a developer to build, right? They said you can build a plex, but you still have to have the same density, the same setbacks, the same floor to area ratio. So really thinking about parking minimums, height limits, what other things can we change to make those projects pencil out? And I mentioned community opposition, which is, there's just so many opportunities for nearby neighbors to block developments in the US. And we know from research that the people who participate in those community meetings tend to be older, white homeowners who are disproportionately opposed to new development. So just another kind of structural thing. And I know I'm running out of time, so I'll go quickly. This is just reinforcing some of the things I said. I think this was a great quote of a contractor we spoke with who said 40 years ago when he first started contracting, he could walk into the building and walk out with a permit in about an hour for $200. And now it takes at least 6 months and it costs you $30,000. That's clearly a huge barrier, right? And lost profit. And then I'll just, many places are also pairing upzonings with other kind of supports and subsidies. Rent control is having a bit of a comeback. Inclusionary zoning. There were some calls for the reforms to low-income housing tax credit. Less optimistic that those are going to happen now. And then we're even seeing some social housing pop up in the U.S., which is exciting. We don't usually get that. But I'll just say, whenever we talk with local leaders, I think people tend to really want to have a silver bullet solution to housing. And we try to emphasize that you really need a suite of solutions, right? You need to have solutions that address both the short, medium, and long term, because different policies have different impacts over those time horizons, right? But you also need to have a suite of policies that help encourage or make sure that there is supply for everyone along the income distribution. So I will pause there and pass it to the next person.
Thanks, Tina. I think a lot of people in the audience will relate to many of the things that you said. It's quite a remarkable similarity in terms of the dialogue. Steve. Oops. Sorry, Steve.
Thanks, Nicole.
Gave away your...
Oh, you're giving away my numbers. Sorry, it's a watershed moment. It's the first time I've ever had to use glasses at a presentation. It's very, very sad. I love coming to Sydney. It's a completely different place from Perth, let's be honest. I'm always amazed at the stark contrast between the two. But I'm not sure how many of you know what's happening in Western Australia at the moment, but we have an election coming up on March the 8th. And housing supply and housing generally is one of the key issues. In fact, the incumbent Labour government are making a housing announcement almost every day at the moment. We've had changes to eligibility limits around our Key Start low deposit home loan. We've had a 75% land tax discount for build-to-rent developments announced, as long as they incorporate 30% affordable rental. We've had more stamp duty relief and an infrastructure development fund. So it really is incredibly high on the political agenda in Western Australia. Not that Labour are going to lose; it's they're an absolute shoo-in. But one does wonder why they've waited 3-4 years to actually make these announcements, which just before the election, politics and all that. But it's a little bit difficult. We're not exactly short of a few dollars in Perth at the moment. But I think there's been a significant debate nationally and locally around housing supply, and I think the Housing Accord targets have really brought that debate to the fore, and for that I'm extremely grateful. Barriers to housing supply, blaming the planning system, usual target, but I think debate's starting to mature a little bit now. There's now discussions around issues of housing economics and around infrastructure as well, so I think those are positive. Now, me personally, I look at planning as actually a positive thing. It's there to deliver options for the private sector developments through land release and appropriate zoning. But it's actually up to the private sector to determine whether or when they actually develop those available sites. And that's a question of economics. Development approvals can, of course, stifle development, but if there is money to be made by the development industry, they will work through those approval processes. But I'm really here to talk about the numbers and deliver a pulse check on how we're doing with housing supply. And who doesn't like a pulse check unless things are going badly wrong? So I thought I'd start by sharing you the state of new housing supply in Australia and start with the rounded numbers for the Housing Accord target, which seem to be on this one. So we can see there, 240,000. That's the annual target to meet our 1.2 million dwellings. I think in terms of a target, it is an ambitious target. And I think it's always good to have a target because it looks like you're trying to make some actual positive action. But I'm glad it's ambitious because it makes it look like there is a housing supply barrier, particularly when we're so far away from actually meeting that target. But we're at a situation where if Australia were actually to have its highest ever annual completions over the next 4.5 years, we would still fall short of the 1.2 million dwellings by about 100,000 dwellings. And most projections are that we might get to a million, but not anywhere near that 1.2 million. So if you compare the average over the last 5 years, the second row on that table, you will see that with the notable exception of Victoria and ACT, there's a big gap between where we are and where we need to be. You can see there, New South Wales, 34% below where it needs to be to meet the Housing Accord target. Even Western Australia is 40%. And there you go, Victoria and ACT are doing well. So some will argue that we've seen some very strong supply in Victoria over the last few years, and now we're starting to see prices moderate. And there is certainly some logic to that. But it's also a case where Victoria is just reaching affordability limits. And that's generally going to be the case around the country, that house price growth is stopped just because it becomes too affordable and there's a very limited purchasing power in those particular areas. But the last 12 months that you can see on the bottom there, we've seen actually a very similar to the average of the last 5 years, with Western Australia really the only state to make any progress in increasing supply. And believe me, the WA Housing Minister is shouting from the rooftops that we're the housing supply state. But we really have come from a very low base, and most of our supply is detached dwellings on the urban periphery. But Australia's record level of housing supply was 219,000 back in 2018. In fact, the period 2016 to 19 was a very strong period of housing supply for the East Coast. New South Wales were almost 30,000 dwellings more than they are at the moment. And in contrast, WA built very little during that period, but we do like to be different. So only the states, again, highlighting in red there, have actually met the target. So Victoria managed to build about 6,000 above the target in its record year of 2017. WA about the same number in 2015. Northern Territory, ACT have done that as well. But whether states that currently have the capacity in the industry to actually meet those sort of levels of housing supply is debatable. So Western Australia, for example, is about 40% down on its capacity. There's no way Western Australia, with its current shortage of industry capacity, could get anywhere near that 32,000 at the moment. We've had hope for many, many years that we would see increases in productivity through new construction and technologies, but it just hasn't happened at any scale. But looking at trends in building commencements and approvals, the bottom two rows there, things are not looking particularly positive outside Western Australia. There's no sign of a big increase in housing completions on the target, so that target of 1.2 million does look like a long way off. So why are we falling short of these housing targets? We've heard already about profit, and that really is the big driver at the moment. From my perspective, the key barrier to housing supplies in the current market is the financial viability, the ability of private sector to actually generate sufficient returns to compensate for the risk of undertaking the development. And while we've seen price rises across the country over the last 4 years, we've also seen significant cost increases, up to 40%, depending on the product and the location that you're building. This means developments that were previously financially viable are no longer so, and are even stalled or shelved altogether, and new sites just aren't being developed. It applies mainly to medium and low density dwellings, because we're still going gangbusters in some parts of the country with detached dwellings in outer area. And higher value areas generally remain profitable because of the revenue you can generate. There just aren't that many opportunities in those locations. Upzoning in high value areas has certainly got the potential to lead to profitable development, but whether it's acceptable development is another matter. So it's the economics of development that really is the main problem. In a normal market, price rises do stimulate new supply, but this hasn't happened because of those higher costs. We're in this bizarre situation now when we need prices to rise to stimulate the new supply that's supposed to improve affordability. So, clearly a broken system. But industry capacity remains problematic. Government are trying to increase labour supply. And supply will eventually pick up, and I think over the next 3 years we will see stronger supply, but we need that industry capacity to actually be there to respond. And I think the Productivity Commission's recent report on construction productivity was really interesting, highlighting some of those key issues the industry needs to resolve, and some of those were around timescales and costs of development. And I think infrastructure has become a really hot topic, sensibly, because if government can support infrastructure provision, there is a way of actually stimulating housing supply. So in Western Australia, we've got an existing $10,000 per apartment subsidy, and it has made some difference at the margins. The Coalition's announcement of their infrastructure fund, $500-600 million, seems to concentrate on greenfield sites, and it will stimulate new supply, but whether that's where we should be concentrating resources is another matter. And then finally, the pitiful level of social housing development over the last few decades has meant the country is almost totally reliant on the private sector to deliver housing. And the housing affordability crisis suggests the strategy has failed, and we need a new approach with a much greater direct provision of social housing and indeed other affordable housing products. So to get Australia to around 5% social housing as a proportion of total stock will require about 25,000 social housing dwellings per annum over the next 10 years. It's a massive and sustained investment from government, and one that's essential if we're going to tackle the long-term housing crisis. So direct provision from government, indirect provision through inclusionary zoning, allowing access to sites for community housing providers, along with sustained certain funding are critical. And I think we've got a long way to go, but there are some positive signs. I think in the past, when we had a similar affordability issues, no one was talking about housing supply. And I think at least that is on the agenda now. And I think the Housing Accord is some way to go to thank for that, even though we're not going to get anywhere near that 1.2 million dwellings. Right. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. So much to talk about. Catherine.
Okay, so I want to actually focus in on a specific case of planning reform, which allows us to really ask, what happens when you remove local land use rules and cede more power to the market or to the private sector to design projects irrespective of land use rules. We've actually done this in New South Wales. So I think as we enter sort of a new period of interest in land use policy reform and how that might impact the impending housing crisis, it's always, or the current housing crisis, I think it's always important to look backwards from where we've come as well. So, some of you may have guessed, but the case I want to share is the infamous major projects reform known as Part 3A. Okay. And I want to give you share with you some of the empirical analysis we've done to look at what this reform actually did. Okay. So the Major Projects Reform Part 3A inserted a new part into our Planning Act in New South Wales. And it really created a new development assessment pathway for major projects. Now, it's not uncommon across planning systems for critical infrastructure projects or public sector-led projects to have sort of special assessment processes. But I think what's important for this particular case is this new assessment pathway also applied to large-scale residential projects and those that were privately owned, so private-led developments on privately owned sites. And what this reform enabled was for developers of those projects effectively to bypass the local land use rules that were in place on those sites and to get a discretionary approval of their projects, even if it was non-compliant. So I sort of delved into the details of the projects that were approved and ultimately identified 85 major residential and mixed use, including residential projects that were approved under the former Part 3A. Now, 80 of those had enough information for a really robust or detailed analysis. So these are 80 major residential and mixed use projects that were approved under Part 3A, all located within Greater Sydney. So what happened? Okay, so 77 of the 80 proposals were ultimately approved. That, you know, I think to get to that stage, you know, there was some conversations leading up to that, so you know, it's not surprising that there was a high approval rate. That equated to over 37,500 approved dwellings, predominantly in projects that were private sector led. 89% of the dwellings that were approved were high-rise apartments on previously developed land. 71% were in the walking catchment of a center. So, you know, really this is about getting approvals within sort of transit-oriented development contexts. Not surprising, given that these are private sector-led projects and there were no statutory requirements for affordable housing inclusion. But across all of the dwellings that were approved in private sector projects, about 0.5% were affordable, dedicated affordable housing. Okay. So how many projects were permissible or not under sort of the baseline planning controls? So what our analysis showed was that 61 of the 77 approved projects would have been considered non-compliant. Okay? And 32 of the projects were not supported by the local government that they were situated within. Now we can speculate about why that was, but I've read through and analyzed the submissions that were made, and they contain some really, you know, important concerns about council's ability to implement their local plans, the infrastructure shortfalls and the serviceability of approved developments, but also a lot of issues around the quality of dwellings, the mix of dwellings. I mean, there was a real predominance of 1 and 2 bedroom apartments, and of course, a huge issue was the affordability. So when I had to sort of conclude the analysis that I'm sharing here in 2016, 31 of the 77 approved schemes had been completed. That equated to 8,700 new dwellings. 22 of the 77 approved schemes had not yet commenced, equating to about 9,000 dwellings. And all of the non-commencing projects were high-density infill. And I think what we've seen over time in Sydney is, you know, a growing number of uncommenced approvals for high-density residential. This doesn't necessarily mean that these projects never commence, but what I think it highlights is that there is that disconnect between, you know, the approval and the supply, for the reasons that my co-presenters have mentioned. So what sort of lessons can we take away from this very specific case? So did it enable housing to be housing approvals that would not otherwise have been permissible? Yeah, it did. It also resulted in demonstration of some new housing typologies, not only transit-oriented development, but also in suburban contexts. There were some public sector-led projects that really demonstrated some housing diversity, so a positive outcome there. But I think what the case really illustrates is the complexity of translating those approvals into supply. You know, highlighting really the challenges beyond obtaining planning permission that can delay high-density infill projects. So yeah, I mean, these approvals were well-located housing relative to transport. But again, if you're in these locations that are highly accessible, high amenity, is this housing that's almost exclusively market rate going to be affordable for some of the people being pushed out of Sydney? I think we can't really reflect on this case without thinking about what the missed opportunities might be as well. For example, for value capture or for affordable housing inclusion. You know, had we mandated it at the time, you know, what would our affordable housing supply look like? And also, I think of course, those of you from Sydney will know the end of this story, which was that actually Part 3A was completely politically unsustainable, and there was a lot of community backlash. So we also have to ask ourselves, you know, what happens when land use change becomes very unpredictable, and in this case it resulted in quite a bit of community anger, and in some cases we're still dealing with some of the infrastructure shortfalls. So we need to always keep in mind not only thinking about planning as a potential barrier, but what is planning for, and it helps us, you know, to manage change in a way, you know, that's coordinated. So I think that's important to reflect on. Thanks.
Thank you, Catherine. And so many parallels for those of you in New South Wales, obviously so many parallels with that and the new Housing Development Authority, some of the lessons which appear to have been picked up. But time for Tim.
Okay, so in Sydney and New South Wales, we're undergoing a raft of mass upzoning reforms. For those of you who are locals, you would be aware of that. It's in the newspaper almost every single day. And for those internationally, I'm sure you've seen this in the research as well. It's not only unique to Sydney, but it's also occurring across the country, in Melbourne, in Perth, by the sounds of it as well. The reason for this is we're being told that the New South Wales planning system is fundamentally flawed, and it is the reason why housing supply has not kept up with growth, and that is also the reason why we have high house prices. Okay, there hasn't been any particular identification of elements of the planning system and what's the actual issue, and okay, we pointed that out. Let's fix that. So we're just told generally, Auckland, good, Sydney, bad. So really that in essence is the argument being put forward. So what you'll see though in this chart is that despite the recent slowdown in construction activity in recent years, is that Australia and Sydney have actually been world leaders in housing supply, as highlighted by the red bar in case you missed it. So, in the last 10 years, Australia has built the most houses it has ever built, okay? Sydney has had the largest housing boom it's ever experienced in the last 10 years. So arguably, you could suggest that Sydney and Australia are world leaders in housing supply. And so let's get on to Auckland then. And this chart shows Sydney dwelling approval against Auckland going back, over 30 years ago. And so what we have here is, most of us are probably aware of the Auckland miracle, and we're also, in case you don't read the newspapers, we have a Sydney planning disaster here. So Auckland really has sort of been the poster boy for neoclassical and YIMBY economics in recent years. It's finally we've got the smoking gun here, right? So everyone, let's just do what Auckland has done. However, as you can see from this chart, that Sydney has experienced a similar housing supply story over the last 30 years with a proper strategic spatial planning process where we coordinate with infrastructure and we focus on creating places. So how is it possible that Sydney has approved and built record numbers of new dwellings while at the same time planning red tape has been a handbrake on new housing supply, forcing up house prices? What I want to make the point is that context is really important. Okay, so over in a place like Auckland, we've got 1,000 square metre lots with detached houses right next to the CBD, and turns out that Auckland, like a lot of North American cities, didn't even allow townhouses. So there's an underlying demand there, right? So we've got this boom in townhouse development, which is highly profitable. You've got large lots right next to the CBD, and in a city that's actually smaller than Perth as well. So does that translate to a global city like Sydney, which actually has one of the highest residential densities in the Anglosphere? So that's really the key question. Context is really important here, okay? And so let's look at this idea of, mass upzoning. We're talking about mass upzoning, TOD, low mid-rise, as if it's like a new idea, as if TOD isn't planning 101 that hasn't been around for 30 years, right? Let's go back to the 90s and talk about one of the largest urban renewal projects at the time, which was Green Square. Okay, so Green Square was identified in the 1990s and upzoned then. We're almost 30 years later, it's still going, it's about 2/3 of the way. Green Square, for those overseas, it's just south of the Sydney CBD, and it's also very close to our beaches and very nice parkland as well. It'll probably take another 10 years. So 35 years to develop arguably one of the best redevelopment sites in all of Australia and all of Sydney. So I don't know why developers there haven't flooded the market and brought prices down, but certainly that is a local example. And we've also got, we've got the poster boat in Auckland, and looking at a more local example in New Zealand, we've sort of got the bad boy, which is Wellington. Okay, it's the NIMBY cousin of Auckland. So Wellington bad, Auckland good. Wellington's got very restrictive planning controls, and of course that has pushed house prices up. However, what we've seen post-COVID is that the NIMBY cousin in Wellington has actually had house prices fall more than any other city in New Zealand, including Auckland. And then we look at recent data and it's still falling. So what's going on here in New Zealand is that planning supply changes in Auckland, or could it be broader macroeconomic forces and potentially also monetary policy as well? And now we come to New South Wales. So the idea is that planning or zoning controls act as a binding constraint to housing supply. They stop developers from providing sufficient housing supply at an aggregate scale. And of course, what that does is that pushes prices up. In the absence of restrictive zoning, what we would see is developers would flood the market with abundant housing. And then that would bring prices down, but they wouldn't stop, they would keep flooding the market with abundant housing. And then eventually, house prices would come down to something that reflects the cost of development. So the New South Wales Productivity Commission, which is a great bastion of housing research in New South Wales, they produced some research last year, I believe, and they indicated that in the previous 5 years, if we had built 40% more housing, house prices would be 1%, house rents would be 1% lower each year, 5.5% over the 5 years. The interesting thing about that, of course, is that 5 years before was Sydney's biggest housing boom. So if we had built 40% more than that, you beauty, we would have prices 5% lower, 1% lower a year, right? So wouldn't that be wonderful if that occurred? And how would that occur, of course, with all of the questions about labour supply, the building capacity, so on and so forth. And to make the point, of course, that Australia and Sydney has one of the highest concentrations of its workforce working in the construction sector as well. So as I say, is that really a groundbreaking number when we've had rents increase by 66% in the 3 years following COVID? And I want to make the point is that we don't talk about demand. Alan Kohler this week, and this is why I put this slide in, Alan Kohler this week wrote an article and he said that the federal government is either unable or unwilling to set an immigration target. And we compare that to Canada, for example, where my understanding is that they've said population is paused for the next couple of years till we sort some things out here. So Sydney, but Melbourne and other Australian cities have had some of the highest population growth in the industrialised world. And in the last couple of years, Sydney should have been completing 70,000 dwellings per annum. Okay, I know that's a bit of an anomaly. We've had really high growth the last couple of years. We only produced around 20,000, and we know that in Sydney our highest ever year was 55,000. So how achievable is this task in the context of population growth? So really that's a critical point. And the other point I want to make too is that, and this is the position put forward by the neoclassical economists and the yippie groups, is that, well, we just need to resolve supply because, the issue is we don't have enough supply and we, compared to underlying demand. And really that's the issue with mainstream economics, is demand is a given, and if we have market failures, it's because there's issues on the supply side. And of course that must be the regulation. So if, of course, high prices are a result of that underlying demand and supply imbalance, why is nobody talking about demand? Clearly the federal government controls that. Clearly they don't control supply. That's something that could be very easily fixed. You could pause it for a couple of years. You could pause growth, right? So that, are people really genuine when they're talking about housing supply? It's hard to believe that they're genuine when they don't speak about, the other demand curve as well. And I just want to leave you with this, to reflect on this great American poet, Drake. So broadly, there are two theories around why house prices are high, as well as other asset classes, industrial, retail, commercial, stocks, so on and so forth. And that idea is that, we've seen the financialisation of housing. Okay, so that's one school of thinking. The other school of thinking, of course, is that no, it's all about supply and therefore it's all about planning as well. So I want to leave you with these charts. These charts show very similar patterns over the last 30 years, but they show very different things. One of those is the price of housing in Sydney since the 1990s, and at the same time scale, by the way. The other chart is the price of agricultural land in Australia, including cropping and grazing. Now I'll leave you with this question. What do you think these two charts have in common? An overly restricted New South Wales planning system, or potentially something broader like macroeconomic forces and monetary policy as well? Thank you.